In Hollywood, they were once the voices that stopped time, soundtracks to love, pain, and hope for a generation of African Americans rising through R&B. On stage, they were untouchable icons. But when the spotlights faded, a darker reality crept in. Backstage fights exploded into violence. Tender love songs hid patterns of toxic control. Secret cameras were planted in bathrooms. Police sirens followed high-speed chases down empty highways. And shockingly, one legend married his best friend's widow, only to later carry on an affair with her own daughter. When the truth surfaced, the entire R&B world froze in disbelief. In this video, we uncover the hidden lives of 17 R&B legends, artists who shaped music history, yet left behind shadows that time can never erase. James Brown, the genius in handcuffs. In the 1960s and 70s, there wasn't a black household in America that didn't know his name. James Brown wasn't just a star, he was a force of nature. With hits like I Got You, I Feel Good, and Papa's Got a Brand New Bag, he didn't simply perform R&B, he detonated it. Every beat snapped, every rhythm bent to his feet. Under the stage lights, he was the godfather of soul, precision incarnate, sweat-soaked, unstoppable, the sound of a generation waking up and demanding to be heard. But when the curtains closed, another James Brown emerged. A man consumed by control, prone to explosive rage, obsessed with dominance. By the 1970s, he had sunk deep into powerful stimulants that fed paranoia and hallucinations. Family members later recalled how he would bolt awake in the dead of night, convinced someone was watching him, plotting against him. Fear quickly curdled into fury, and that fury turned violent. The primary target was Adriana, his wife for many years. She lived in constant fear, hospitalized multiple times from his beatings. In 1994, she finally went public, accusing James Brown of domestic violence. Court records painted a chilling picture: punches thrown in the darkness, baseless jealousy, moments where drugs erased any remaining restraint. The genius of soul music, reduced to terror behind closed doors. His tyranny extended beyond the home. On stage, James Brown ruled through fear. Musicians described working for him as suffocating. Miss a note, get fined. Make eye contact the wrong way, get fired mid-show. One saxophonist later said James didn't need loyalty. He needed fear. Fear kept the machine running. Then came September 24, 1988, in Augusta, Georgia, his hometown. The city that had raised a statue in his honor, that once called him the pride of the South. That day, James Brown stormed into an insurance office carrying a shotgun. The trigger for his rage was absurd. Someone had used a restroom in the building that he believed was reserved exclusively for him. Eyes wild, hands shaking around the gun, he screamed as office workers scattered in panic. Some ran. Others hid beneath desks. Phones rang frantically as police were called. But before security could stop him, James Brown bolted for his pickup truck, floored the gas, and tore onto the highway like a man possessed, blazing across state lines from Georgia into South Carolina. Police chased him at full speed, sirens wailing like a requiem for a legend in freefall. Officers were eventually forced to shoot out his tires to bring the pursuit to an end. Even after he was subdued, James Brown thrashed violently, mumbling incoherently, disconnected from reality. The image that followed became infamous. James Brown in a wrinkled tracksuit, hair disheveled, eyes glazed over, staring blankly in a mugshot that shocked the world. The godfather of soul, reduced to a cautionary symbol. He was sentenced to 6 years in prison for evading police, illegal possession of a firearm, and endangering the public. Though he served just over 2.5 years before being released for good behavior, the damage was done. The music lived on. The legend survived. But the image of James Brown in handcuffs, once unimaginable, became an indelible stain, a reminder that even giants can fall, and that genius does not grant immunity from darkness. Rick James, the rebel wrapped in fire. If James Brown was the godfather of soul, then Rick James was the untamed prince of funk and R&B, ruling the 1980s with sweat, sex, and sound. On stage, he was pure liberation, a fearless icon who made an entire generation feel free in their own skin. But the brighter Rick James burned, the more violently he burned himself. Addiction, rage, and a growing sense of invincibility slowly consumed the man behind the music. On a suffocating July night in 1991, inside a lavish yet unsettling mansion hidden deep in Laurel Canyon, music thundered for hours without pause. The living room glowed in purple light as Rick James drifted through the crowd like a fallen god, long braids hanging loose, wrapped in a crimson velvet robe, eyes bloodshot from days without sleep. At his side stood Tanya Hijazi, his young girlfriend, her gaze sharp, distant, and calculating as if she trusted no one in the room. What happened that night remains shrouded in fragments and whispers. Some said Rick exploded after a woman refused a drink he offered. Others claimed they heard screams echo from upstairs, though every stairway had been blocked. One account described a locked room at the end of a hallway, the door sealed from the inside, the walls shaking as pounding fists begged to be heard, only to be swallowed by the relentless music. By morning, the woman was seen leaving the mansion wrapped in an oversized coat, her face bruised, her eyes hollow. When the story broke, the music world was stunned. But the spiral didn't stop there. While awaiting trial, Rick became involved in another violent incident, this time at a West Hollywood hotel. He invited a woman up to listen to a demo. When she said she didn't like the track, his temper detonated. He smashed the cassette player against the wall, yanked her by the hair, and held her captive for hours. Each detail, as reported to police, landed like a final blow. 2 incidents, nearly back-to-back. 2 women. 2 locations. 1 undeniable truth. Rick James had lost control, not just of his addiction, but of himself. The wild, electrifying force who once shook an entire decade with funk anthems had become a symbol of power gone rotten. In 1993, Rick James was convicted on serious charges and sentenced to nearly 3 years in prison. When he entered the correctional facility in an orange jumpsuit, hair unkempt and face worn thin, no one saw Super Freak anymore. They saw a broken man. Somewhere between the music, the hallucinations, and the unchecked power, how did a talent this immense fall so far and end in tragedy? Al Green. Al Green. The angelic image undone by deception. Once upon a time, Al Green was the soft-spoken saint of 1970s R&B. His voice, silky, intimate, almost heavenly, turned love into something sacred. Songs like Let's Stay Together didn't just play on the radio, they lived in people's hearts, promising devotion, loyalty, and emotional purity. To the world, Al Green embodied the ideal man, gentle, refined, and devoted to love itself. But behind that halo was a far more troubled soul. Offstage, Al Green was tangled in secrets, contradictions, and emotional wreckage, leaving behind more pain than the tenderness he sang about. And then came one night in October 1974, inside his modest Memphis home, an evening that shattered everything. As Al rested in the bathroom, his girlfriend Mary Woodson suddenly appeared. In her hands was a pot of boiling water. Without warning, without a word, she threw it onto him. His skin burned instantly. His screams filled the house. Neighbors rushed to call for help as paramedics arrived to a scene they would never forget. Moments later, the tragedy deepened. Mary took her own life with a gun Al had hidden in the home. The media erupted. Headlines painted it as a love-driven madness, a real-life Greek tragedy fueled by obsession. But the truth was darker and more human. Mary had just discovered that Al Green had secretly married another woman. Even worse, she wasn't the only one. In her diary, she wrote of betrayal, manipulation, and living as a shadow beside a man she once believed was divine. That night didn't just scar Al Green's body, it stripped away the holy illusion surrounding his name. The boiling water burned more than skin. It exposed the fractures beneath the sacred voice America had worshipped. Though he later became a pastor and sang of redemption, for many, Al Green remains the man who once sanctified love, only to betray it in the cruelest way imaginable. Kelly. A king crowned by music, then exiled by the very industry that once worshipped him. No name on this list carries a scandal longer, darker, or more disturbing than R. Kelly, the man once celebrated as the undisputed king of R&B, responsible for timeless hits like I Believe I Can Fly, Ignition, Remix, and Step in the Name of Love. On stage, he wore white suits and preached love, faith, and redemption. Behind closed doors, he was building something far more sinister. As early as the late 1990s, whispers followed him, stories of manipulation, control, and abuse involving underage girls. In 2002, a shocking tape surfaced showing Kelly with a minor, yet the legal battle dragged on for years, ending without accountability. For a long time, fame and silence protected him. That silence finally shattered in 2019 with Surviving R. Kelly, a documentary that exposed a horrifying reality, a hidden world of coercion, imprisonment, and psychological abuse masquerading as love. In 2022, justice caught up. R. Kelly was sentenced to 30 years in prison, bringing a brutal end to a legacy built on lies. Once a man who sang about hope and dreams, he became someone the entire music industry rejected. Today, I Believe I Can Fly no longer feels inspirational. It echoes as a tragic reminder of how far a fallen king can fall from the throne he destroyed himself. Ike Turner, a musical pioneer who never stopped denying the damage he caused. Born in Mississippi, Ike Turner helped lay the foundation of rock and roll with Rocket 88 and rose to fame as one half of the explosive duo Ike and Tina Turner, dominating R&B in the 1960s and 70s. On stage, he was electrifying, a guitarist with fire in his hands and a mind that could manufacture hits. Off stage, he ruled through fear. Behind the glitter and the applause lived a man obsessed with control, capable of brilliance and brutality in the same breath, especially toward the woman beside him. Everything changed one night in 1976 at the Statler Hilton Hotel in Dallas. It should have been routine, another show, another drive back. Instead, inside their Cadillac, Ike struck Tina. It wasn't the first time, but this blow was different. Blood streamed from her nose. In a brief moment when Ike turned away, Tina made a choice that would save her life. She opened the car door and ran. No money, no bags, no plan. Just bare feet, bruised skin, and the will to survive. She sprinted across a busy boulevard, found refuge in a small motel, and began again with nothing. That night marked Tina's freedom, and the beginning of Ike's collapse. After she left, Ike clung to his image as a powerful music king, but his world unraveled. Addiction tightened its grip. Erratic behavior and allegations of abuse followed him for decades. In 1989, he landed in jail on drug charges. Even then, he denied everything. "I never hit Tina," he insisted. But witnesses, court records, and Tina's autobiography Tina told a far darker truth. In 1993, What's Love Got to Do With It forced America to confront the violence behind the glamour, shattering the illusion Ike had tried to protect. When he died in 2007 from a cocaine overdose while attempting a comeback, the public had already turned away. His music remains influential, but his name is inseparable from a legacy of abuse, one no amount of talent could ever erase. Bobby Womack, the scoundrel. By the early 1970s, everyone knew Bobby Womack's voice, the smoky baritone behind Across 110th Street, and If You Think You're Lonely Now, one of the most influential soul and R&B artists of his era. His music spoke of heartbreak, regret, and longing with painful honesty. But behind the brilliance was a life marked by shocking decisions, beginning with a tragedy that would forever stain his name. In 1964, America mourned the sudden death of soul legend Sam Cooke. At the funeral, Bobby Womack, Sam's protege, the young man he had guided like a little brother, stood beside the casket in tears, grieving in full view of the world. Few could have imagined what would follow. Less than 3 months later, on March 5, 1965, in Los Angeles, a 21-year-old Bobby was seen walking hand in hand with Barbara Cooke, Sam's widow, 10 years his senior, emerging from a quiet wedding ceremony in a small suburban church. Cameras flashed. There was no apology, no explanation, only stiff smiles and a wedding ring. The reaction was brutal. Sam Cooke's family was horrified. The press erupted. Fans, especially within the Black community, viewed the marriage as an unforgivable betrayal. Newspapers labeled Bobby a traitor. Radio stations banned his records almost overnight. The doors that Sam Cooke had once opened for him slammed shut. And then things got even darker. In 1970, Barbara discovered Bobby was secretly involved with Linda Cooke, her daughter with Sam. Linda was underage. When the truth came out, rage exploded inside their Los Angeles home. Overcome by betrayal, Barbara grabbed a gun hidden in the closet and fired. The bullet grazed Bobby's left cheek, leaving a scar he would carry for the rest of his life. Once hailed as a musical prodigy entrusted with the future of soul, Bobby Womack became a name spoken with suspicion and disgust. Invitations dried up. Trust vanished. Though his career never fully died, thanks to haunting classics like Across 110th Street, his public image was permanently fractured. In the end, Bobby Womack left behind a legacy that forces an uncomfortable question. Where do you draw the line between a brilliant star and a deeply flawed man? Chuck Berry, the guitar god, and the secrets hidden behind a bathroom door. Born in 1926 in St. Louis, Chuck Berry wasn't just a rock and roll pioneer. He was the missing link between old-school rhythm and blues and a new, rebellious youth culture. With anthems like Johnny B. Good and Maybelline, he turned the electric guitar into a loaded weapon, his lyrics into acts of defiance, and cracked open the door for generations of black artists to finally claim center stage. Rock music, as the world came to know it, simply wouldn't exist without him. But every blazing spotlight casts a shadow, and Berry's shadow would eventually become impossible to ignore. In 1961, his rise came to a sudden halt when he was arrested for violating the Mann Act after transporting an underage girl from Texas to work at his Missouri nightclub. Berry insisted he was only trying to help her, but the court wasn't convinced. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison, a devastating fall for a man who had become a cultural symbol of freedom and swagger. Behind bars, there were no screaming fans, no guitar riffs, only silence and the cold, unforgiving stare of a public that once worshipped him. Many believed that chapter marked his reckoning. They were wrong. Nearly 30 years later, an even darker scandal surfaced. On December 17, 1990, several women who worked at Southern Air, a restaurant owned by Berry, filed a lawsuit. 4 months, they said, they'd felt watched, an uneasy sense that unseen eyes followed them behind the mirror. Then, during routine cleaning, the truth was exposed, a hidden camera mounted above a hand dryer in the women's restroom. The revelation exploded across the media. Chuck Berry, now in his 60s, long removed from his rock and roll prime, was suddenly linked to something deeply disturbing. When police searched his home in Wentzville, Missouri, they uncovered more than 60 videotapes, hours of intimate footage, countless women unknowingly recorded. Though Berry avoided criminal conviction, the damage was done. He paid hundreds of thousands of dollars to settle civil lawsuits. And while he continued performing until the end of his life, the spell was broken. The music was still there, but for many, the legend was never quite the same again. Marvin Gaye. Marvin Gaye, the shadow behind a heavenly voice. Revered as the very soul of soul music and R&B, Marvin Gaye was the man who lifted the genre beyond entertainment and turned it into a mirror for society's pain, love, and injustice. Yet behind the velvet vocals and tender love songs lived a deeply troubled man, isolated, haunted, and slowly unraveling in a darkness no melody could quiet. By the 1970s, Marvin was sinking fast, consumed by drugs, anxiety, and crippling depression. One night in October 1977, inside his Hollywood Hills mansion, paranoia took over. Lost in addiction, he became convinced his wife Janice had betrayed him over nothing more than a glance exchanged at a party. He locked the bedroom door, turned Trouble Man up loud, a bitter, mocking soundtrack to his own collapse. Janice sat frozen on the edge of the bed in her evening gown, tears streaming silently down her face. Some nights, she was trapped for hours, shut away in the studio, forced to listen as Marvin argued with voices only he could hear. Not even soundproof walls could block the cold fear creeping into her heart. Their home became a battlefield of rage, emotional distance, and violence. Marvin pushed everyone out, friends, collaborators, even family, until he was left alone, surrounded by unfinished records, cocaine, and a suffocating loneliness. On the morning of April 1, 1984, after a furious argument inside their Los Angeles home, Marvin Gaye was shot and killed by his own father, using a gun Marvin himself had bought for protection. It was a devastating end to a genius who once asked the world, "What's going on?" yet never found the answer within himself. George Clinton. Visionary genius, or a ruthless power hoarder? As the psychedelic architect of Parliament Funkadelic, Clinton fused R&B, soul, and funk into a cosmic, sci-fi fantasy known as P-Funk, a world of rainbow wigs, wild mythology, and endless grooves. But behind the spectacle lived a tightly controlled empire, one man holding all the strings. By the late 1980s, as P-Funk's shine began to dim, ugly truths surfaced. Former members, including drummer Jerome Bigfoot Braley and lead singer Fuzzy Haskins, accused Clinton of skimming royalties, manipulating contracts, and funneling the group's earnings into accounts bearing only his name. In September 1987, inside a modest Atlanta hotel, the band gathered for what was supposed to be an honest reckoning. Clinton arrived late, draped in a purple wig and a sequined robe. When someone dared ask about royalties tied to 3 missing albums, he slammed his hand on the table and snapped, "There's only one father here, and it's me." The room went dead quiet. In that moment, the so-called P-Funk family knew it was already broken. Over the next decade, lawsuits piled up from New York to Los Angeles. Clinton denied every charge, but studio tapes, signed paperwork, and insider testimony told a darker story. He wasn't just the frontman, he controlled the vault. Even as Clinton kept touring into the 2010s, collecting awards and praise as a funk legend, to many of the artists who built that sound with him, he wasn't an icon at all, just a tyrant who took it all. Ronald Isley. Ronald Isley, the debt-burdened gentleman with an obsession for luxury. The velvet voice of the Isley Brothers, he gave life to timeless classics like Between the Sheets and For the Love of You. Draped in tailored suits, dark designer shades, and effortless charm, he defined R&B sophistication for generations. Yet behind the polished image lurked a tangled financial reality few fans ever imagined. On a scorching Friday afternoon in June 2003, IRS agents arrived at Isley's Beverly Hills mansion carrying thick folders packed with unpaid taxes, suspicious bank accounts, and questionable asset records. Inside the garage gleamed a brand new Bentley beside a vintage Rolls-Royce, both untouched by tax payments. On the dining table sat a half-empty wine glass and scattered cigarette ashes, the quiet aftermath of a party that felt eerily like the crumbling illusion around him. The truth soon erupted. While performing like a billionaire on stage, Isley was quietly drowning in debt behind the scenes. Then, on an October day in 2006, he stepped out of a Los Angeles federal courtroom not as the confident Mr. Biggs, but as a man sentenced to 3 years in prison for tax evasion. His music endured, but the flawless image of an R&B gentleman cracked under the heavy weight of every line in the indictment. Michael Jackson, angel or enigma? How does a man who reshaped modern pop while honoring the roots of soul and R&B end up surrounded by shadows as heavy as his legacy is bright? Behind the dazzling stages and moonwalk magic, accusations followed him like a storm that never fully passed. In August 1993, at Neverland Ranch, his sprawling Santa Barbara estate once described as a child's fantasyland, a young boy, Jordan Chandler, and his father filed a civil lawsuit accusing Jackson of betraying their trust and crossing deeply sensitive boundaries. The world split overnight. Some grieved the possible fall of a beloved icon. Others questioned what truths might have been hidden behind Neverland's gates. Jackson was never criminally charged in that case, but he settled the lawsuit for a reported $23 million, leaving a permanent stain on his public image. More than a decade later, in 2005, he faced another highly publicized trial in Santa Maria, California, enduring 4 intense months beneath relentless media scrutiny. Though he was ultimately acquitted of all charges, the once unstoppable king of pop seemed forever changed. A man who had made the world dance now moving through fame like a fragile echo of his former self. David Ruffin. David Ruffin, the electrifying voice that helped define the Temptations, was both a musical genius and a man haunted by his own ego. Born in 1941, he became the unforgettable lead behind classics like My Girl, a performance that once set every R&B stage on fire. But behind the spotlight, tension simmered. By the summer of 1967, during a Chicago tour stop, Ruffin reportedly pushed for the group to be renamed David Ruffin and the Temps, convinced he was the true centerpiece. When the idea was rejected, accounts say he exploded backstage at the Regal Theater, smashing a mirror and refusing to perform, leaving nearly 2,000 fans in stunned chaos. His bandmates grew exhausted by chronic lateness, missed shows, and sudden disappearances. Around the same time, troubling reports surfaced about volatile moments in his personal life, including a widely discussed 1967 Detroit party where, in a jealous outburst, he allegedly threw a drink at girlfriend and fellow singer Tammy Terrell. By 1968, the tension reached its breaking point, and Ruffin was abruptly dismissed from the Temptations. What followed was a painful spiral through addiction, anger, and a solo career that never fully regained its early brilliance. On June 1, 1991, Ruffin died alone in Philadelphia from a drug overdose, his once blazing legacy shadowed by personal demons. To many R&B fans, his story remains a powerful warning. Even the brightest voice can be consumed when fame burns hotter than self-control. Prince, a musical genius who often felt like he was at war with the world. Throughout the 1980s and 90s R&B era, Prince stood untouchable, a fearless innovator and a fiercely independent artist who controlled every note, every lyric, every detail of his sound. But behind the brilliance, many collaborators described a man who could be cold, distant, and relentlessly demanding. One wrong move, one missed note, and you were out without a second chance. In 1993, when Warner Brothers attempted to control his release schedule, Prince fought back in dramatic fashion, filing lawsuits, abandoning his birth name, and appearing on television with a mysterious, unpronounceable symbol. The world began calling him the artist formerly known as Prince, while critics mocked him as a rebellious eccentric with a purple guitar. Yet in Prince's mind, he wasn't the villain. He believed the real betrayal came from an industry that tried to cage his creativity. Backstage stories painted an even more intense picture. Some claimed Prince rarely acknowledged anyone he considered beneath his level, insisting on strict respect and near-perfect discipline. Long nights in the studio were common, sometimes spent obsessing over a single drum beat he felt wasn't purple enough, not magical enough to meet his vision. One former assistant once said, he didn't want companions, he wanted total devotion. When Prince passed away in 2016, the world grieved the loss of a revolutionary icon whose music changed generations. But behind the glowing tributes, a few insiders remembered a different side, not just a mentor or a legend, but a commanding force whose silent stare alone could make an entire studio hold its breath. Bobby Brown, the ultimate bad boy who couldn't outrun his own chaos. Once crowned the electrifying heartthrob of 90s R&B, he ruled the charts with hits like My Prerogative and Don't Be Cruel, fueled by swagger, raw charisma, and a rebellious edge fans couldn't ignore. But beyond the spotlight, controversy followed him like a shadow, with repeated headlines about legal trouble, substance abuse, and a life spinning dangerously out of control. His high-profile marriage to Whitney Houston, America's golden voice, gradually became a story marked by turmoil and heartbreak. In the 2018 documentary Whitney, members of her family described their relationship as deeply troubled, alleging that Bobby's behavior contributed to a cycle of addiction and emotional strain. A 2003 arrest in Georgia over a domestic dispute added to the growing storm around his name, followed by years of run-ins with the law, from public altercations to alcohol-related incidents. As the music faded and the scandals grew louder, Bobby Brown's legacy became more complicated than his chart-topping success, a cautionary tale of fame, ego, and a man wrestling with his own demons. Otis Redding Jr., a man born into greatness, yet forever chasing a shadow he could never outrun. As the son of soul legend Otis Redding, he carried a name that opened doors but also weighed heavily on his shoulders. He possessed undeniable vocal talent and flashes of charisma, but discipline and self-control often slipped through his fingers, and in the unforgiving world of R&B, those traits can define survival. Though respected in small local scenes, his career never truly broke free from the towering legacy behind him. After his passing in 2007, some relatives shared troubling stories, alleging a life marked by reckless choices, heavy drinking, and turbulent behavior at home. One particularly haunting account described him locking his young son in a dark room for simply playing Marvin Gaye, an artist he reportedly viewed as a rival in his own troubled mind. Fueled by unresolved anger, endless late-night parties, and a quiet resentment toward his father's immortal fame, Otis Jr.'s life slowly unraveled into a deeply personal tragedy. A man remembered not for the promise he carried, but for the battles he could never quite win. Teddy Pendergrass. In the 1970s, Teddy Pendergrass stood as R&B's ultimate sex symbol, a magnetic voice, raw intensity, and a stage presence that made him the fantasy of millions. He radiated power and passion, a performer whose energy felt larger than life. But beyond the spotlight, the story was far more complicated. On March 18, 1982, in Philadelphia, Teddy drove his brand-new Rolls-Royce into the night with a passenger beside him. Moments later, the car veered off the road and slammed into a tree, leaving him paralyzed from the chest down. In the aftermath, rumors spread quickly about the identity of the passenger, and tabloid headlines ignited controversy that shook fans and the industry alike. At a time when prejudice and speculation ran rampant, Teddy's silence only fueled gossip and harsh judgment. Critics and insiders whispered about his relationships and accused him of selfish choices that had finally caught up with him, though much of it remained rumor rather than confirmed truth. For many observers, the crash symbolized more than a tragic accident. It marked the collapse of a carefully crafted image. Yet Teddy returned to music with remarkable determination, performing from a wheelchair with undeniable soul and resilience. Still, the shadows of that night lingered, and the unanswered questions followed him for years. He rarely spoke in detail about what happened, offering only a quiet reflection. That accident was the harshest lesson of my life. Like many stories buried in the world of R&B, the full truth may have been lost on that dark Philadelphia road in 1982. We've just revisited a string of stories more shocking than anyone could have imagined. The spotlight has the power to create legends, but when it turns toward the shadows, it reveals every hidden crack. So tell us, did you once idolize any of them? And now that you've heard the deeper stories, do you see them differently? Share your thoughts in the comments, and stay tuned for more mysterious and chilling stories still to come.